Okay, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. So I hope things are going well for you. I know that a day that writing assignment or something similar is due, there's a little bit like you're anxious and focused on that, trying to get that done. So I definitely understand and recognize where you're coming from. I've been there before. So as we get started for today, I do want to give you a couple reminders, things to know as you're finishing up this assignment and turning it in. So this group membership reflection, right, is the assignment where I'm asking you to think about a group that you are a part of or have been a part of and to write about your experience and participation within that group, right? So the prompt asks you to think about what that group is, how you define yourself within that group, using Belbin's self-perception inventory, what that describes the roles that you fulfill in this group, and then some of the strengths and weaknesses of the way the group communicates. So as a reminder, by the end of the day today, if you haven't already submitted it, please make sure to submit this assignment to Canvas. Please submit it as a doc, docx, or PDF, right? So please don't submit it as a pages, which oftentimes if you use a tablet is the file extension. Those can be weird and difficult to convert. Please do not submit it as a Google Doc, right? When I say submit as doc, like that's a .doc extension. The reason for that, right, is that because a Google Doc can change, be modified, be edited, and so on over time, that means that there isn't really a stable version of the text that I can receive. So the easiest way if you use Google Docs is to just download the doc as like a doc or docx file, and then submit that to Canvas. Don't do the like just text box either, since you'll lose the formatting. If you're burning midnight oil, what I recommend is that you give yourself an extra 10 to 15 minutes before midnight to upload it, just in case there's any tech or weird issues that come up in the uploading process. If you realize you have to make a revision or you resubmit it, right, that's okay. I will use the most recently submitted file. It shows me a history of each file you've submitted. So you can submit the most recent one. If you need to make changes, you can submit another one if you realize there's something you did wrong. If you're worried, like you're having trouble getting it on Canvas, you're having spotty internet, a really great way to check in on that is to email me your assignment in case it's not working on Canvas. That way I have a timestamped version of it and I know that you've turned that in on time. If you are not able to turn it in on time, right, and it's unexcused or if there isn't like something like an emergency or issue that came up that prevented you from finishing it, it is minus 5% for each day late. So that's like a 95 to 90%, and that goes on for each day an assignment is late. Remember that in this class, you have to get out of jail free card. You can turn in one assignment in the class up to a week late with no penalty. You could choose to use it on this assignment if you're feeling pretty behind and you would like to. Just send me an email letting me know that you intend to use that for this assignment. And remember that you need to cite for this assignment. The only thing that you really need to be citing from would be the textbook, right? The reason for this is because the textbook would be going over things like Belbin's self-perception inventory, like group membership, and some of those elements that you'd be drawing from, right? So you should be citing from the book. Remember, if it's not common knowledge or your own experience, it's a good idea to bring in that citation. What I would do, right, is bring in a couple quotes or concepts that relate to, for instance, the membership role in Belbin's self-perception inventory that you selected. Make sure to include a page number if you're doing a direct quote. And I definitely discourage procrastination on citing sources in particular, right? Because working through them as you go means it's a lot less intimidating. The full text of the citation is available on Canvas to make that a little bit easier for you. So remember, right, I'd much rather have an assignment that's late. It's much more strategic to turn in an assignment late because if you don't cite sources, right, that's at best 0 on the paper, at worst 0 in the class. I hate it when that happens. So do try to give yourself the time you need to get that worked out. If you're running into issues with submitting the assignment, or you realize after class that you have any last minute questions, concerns, or issues, remember that I do have office hours right after class. I just go upstairs to Ackerman 204C, and you're welcome to either visit me after class, or you can join me through Zoom during that time too in that room. Alternatively, you can send me an email. I'll do my best to answer emails as they come up this evening or things that might come up on your end. Any questions regarding this assignment as you're wrapping it up and getting ready to turn it in? Great. Again, if they come up later, I'll do my best to answer your questions as soon as I can. And I'm looking forward to hearing about the different groups you're a part of and what you've learned through that process. So last class, we took time to workshop the group membership reflection. Again, we did an activity where I was asking you to think about and share your progress with somebody else or with a group of 3. So we did a little bit there. We also started to talk about culture, right? The idea that culture is important to the relationships and communication that we do in groups. Remember, one key takeaway from this week is that culture has 2 major parts. That is, we bring our own culture and our own background into the groups that we're a member of, right? So if you find that you're the only person in your group of a different race or ethnicity or gender, right? You're bringing that culture and experience in to that group. And at the same time, right, groups themselves develop culture over time. A workplace culture, a team culture, right? You develop a shared sense of identity and experience. It becomes important to how your group engages. So we talked about some of those ideas last class. For instance, last class I had us look through a kind of world map that geographically shows us many of the First Nation and Indigenous peoples and where geographically those populations are located, right? And we talked about how things like physical space, territory, mountains, oceans, and so on, right? Many ways to define groups' identity, the physical spaces that are important and that matter to particular groups of people, right? That culture is about history, it's about context, it's about the background of who you are and what you do, right? There's a good chance when you've joined something like a team or group that there are trophies, medals, plaques, halls of fame, right? And everything detailing the history of that group. Again, things like beliefs, values, traditions, what that group has done over the past, and what beliefs are important to that group, in many ways shape their current participation. We also talked last class about the idea of intracultural versus intercultural communication, using the example of American Sign Language or ASL, right? Intracultural would be 2 people communicating using ASL and using that shared language. Whereas intercultural would be perhaps somebody like a parent of a deaf child who doesn't necessarily speak ASL themselves, but maybe chooses to learn the language in order to engage and work with their child. Someone last class brought up a kind of shocking statistic, my other class, where only about 7% of parents of deaf children actually learn ASL. So an interesting example, right, of the ways that intercultural communication is not always practiced, right? You could think about things such as ethnocentrism at play there. You will learn to read lips or you will learn to speak my language, right? Being used as a rationale for maybe why deaf parents would not learn that. So a bit concerning, right? Ethnocentrism, as we mentioned, gets at the idea of believing that one's own culture or perspective is better than another person's. Of course, it's a challenge we have to actively work against as we're trying to think about different cultures that participate and contribute to the groups that we're a part of. We also started to talk about some of the applications, right, and ways that we can use culture and situate culture in thinking about groups, not only in the goals and purpose of the groups, but also in the ways that small groups' history and the things that they do, right, are shaped by culture as well over time. So for this class, we're going to be building on some of these ideas further to understand more specific applications of culture to small group communication. Some of the theories and ways of thinking about small group communication, right? So if you've taken a class like interpersonal communication in the past, or another class with me, you probably know, I talked about the idea of uncertainty reduction theory, or URT. So we'll be reviewing that or going over that for the first time if you haven't heard of this one before. And some of the ways that we can measure and think about culture differently. If you think back to last class, we brought up Stuart Hall, one of the major developers of cultural studies, right? And Hall's idea is that we can compare cultures not as better or worse, but as different, right? And that they communicate and express themselves in very distinct ways. So when we think about what it means for groups to express and convey culture, right? You might think about a lot of classic ways that that happens. Passing the torch, right, is commonly used as a metaphor, like a relay, right, where you're passing something along to somebody else. And this oftentimes happens when more senior or established members of a group are trying to help newer members join or participate, especially when it's a group with an expiration date, such as an extracurricular or an athletic team, right? That is, many times older members are concerned, they want the group to stay healthy, to continue to be successful into the future, right? And in doing so, they are really trying to create trust in new membership. So when I was involved in speech and debate in college, right, that was something we did where a lot of the seniors on the team, right, would do a lot of mentoring, advising, and support for the newer members. Sometimes senior debaters would partner with first-year debaters for tournaments to help and guide them and help them build skills, right? Another idea in joining a group and then going from that new member stage to more of an established or current member, right, is the issue of rights and at worst things like hazing, right? So colleges and universities have group life, frats, sororities, and so on. Those can sometimes be great, right? They can be a source of community and good relationships, but that can also at times be a problem, right? There's been a lot of stories and reports about how a lot of times the hazing rituals or initiation for new members can at times be really dangerous or even fatal, right? Like asking people to drink like unhealthy amounts of alcohol. So that can be a challenge, right? Is that creating and initiating new members in the group can be a way to help people feel included and to feel involved, but it can also go to a dangerous extreme, right? Where the effort to get new members in or to make fun of new members or to force members to go through difficult things, right? In order to really be a part of the group can definitely be a major challenge. So that's something to balance. Another attitude that oftentimes comes up in these situations is well, I went through this, so you have to as well, right? And that attitude and mentality oftentimes shapes new membership. Additionally, right, as part of a group, you might run into challenges and pushback based on tradition. We've tried this before and it doesn't work. If you're a new member of a group and you come in with a new idea, like maybe you're a member of a hiking club and you say, why don't we go out on this trail? And they say, no, we've tried that, we don't like this trail, right? Groupthink, if you've taken a class like conflict management, refers to the idea that we as people in a group tend to self-censor, right? To not share our full opinions or experiences because we don't want to disagree or rock the boat and we want other people to agree with us. So these kinds of practices and behaviors are developed in small groups over time and are a big part of how groups experience and practice culture. So pictured here on the right is a map that has a spectrum of cultures that run from individualistic to collectivist, right? So some of the lighter hued countries are countries that are considered to be more collectivist in their orientation. So we see some of the lighter countries in areas of South America, Africa, and in some regions in Asia, right? Whereas more individualistic cultures are darker. So ones like the United States, Canada, Australia, and particularly in Western Europe, right? So the way of thinking about these differences is to think about differences and how cultures express themselves and establish goals. So in an individualistic culture, and like the United States or like Australia, there tends to be a much greater focus on individual achievement and success, right? One way of thinking about this is an internal locus of control. That is, I as a person am capable of changing the world. I have free will. I have the ability to make decisions, right? And we hear this metaphor discussed a lot in some of the ways that, for instance, American Dream type discourse is used, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and so on type of discourse is used in many ways in an individualistic way. That you have control over events in your life and that you can agentically choose to do things that cause your life to occur in a certain way. It also places responsibility, right, on the individual as the person who, in many situations, is seen as causing their life to happen the way it does, which we know has some problems when we think about it more broadly surrounding social and cultural issues. Whereas in more collectivist cultures, again, in areas including in South America and places in Asia in particular, right? In a more collectivist culture, there tends to be a greater focus on the harmony and cohesion of the group. And more often in collectivist cultures, there's an approach that views an external locus of control. That is, that individuals don't necessarily control the outcome of their lives or the way that that happens as much, more than it's society and other parts that guide and control much of your life, who you choose to spend your time with, how your relationship develops over time, and so on. So this kind of spectrum is a good way of thinking about culture and some of the ways that culture can be differentiated in those areas, right? When you're part of a group, the cultural background is going to shape how members work together. Again, in individualistic cultures, maybe people are more likely to come in with their own ideas and advocate for what they want, whereas in more collectivist cultures, maybe there's a focus on trying to smooth things over among them. It's important to think about how the goals and purpose of a group might look different depending on where they fall on this spectrum. Another idea that I think is useful when we're thinking about and comparing cultural experience are the idea of rules, right? So again, if you've joined something such as an extracurricular or sports team or something similar, there's a good chance you signed off on some type of handbook or contract. And that's an explicit rule culture, right? Where there are clearly marked things that you should or shouldn't do, or ways that group members should or should not behave, right? Whereas in an implicit rule culture, those things are suggested and they're not hard-coded in the same way. For instance, if you go and travel internationally to another country, you realize that maybe in a lot of countries, you're not supposed to tip. It's considered impolite to tip. Or in a lot of restaurants in the United States, water is free, but you might be charged for water in other states or in other countries. So nonverbal communication plays a larger role in more implicit cultures. So I know that there is at least a couple of folks that have taken a class like interpersonal communication, including a couple of people that took it with me. So does anybody want to take a stab at defining or explaining in their own words uncertainty reduction theory? Yeah, Kenna.
I'm pretty sure it's just like when you first meet someone, you ask more questions and just get to know them better. Right?
Yeah. So that's a major part of it, right? That's actually one of the major axioms of URT, right? So uncertainty reduction theory is theory that helps us to understand how we communicate and how we relate to each other in small groups. If you're ever running into issues or you're not sure like what this is, I think a really easy way to remember it is stranger danger, right? So when you were young, probably through parents or family members, right, or earlier in school, you were told, don't talk to strangers, right, under the premise that you don't know who that person is. They could be unsafe or hostile toward you. So, talk to people that you trust, that you know well, and so on, right? And that premise guides a lot of the way we think about URT. The central argument or thesis of uncertainty reduction theory is that for us as humans, right, we encounter uncertainty about our groups and people that we engage with every single day. And as a result of that, right, as Kenna mentioned, we seek out information or we choose to communicate with other people in different ways based on what we know. You can think about this, right, in a kind of out in the wild kind of way, right? If we're observing somebody that's eating berries from a bush and they die, they get poisoned, we're not going to eat the berries, right? We're cautious or concerned about whether we should eat something, knowing that that could be hazardous or fatal, right? So in a survival instinct type of way, we're constantly seeking out information, figuring out the terrain, figuring out if we're in a safe place to be, right? So that can be a major challenge of uncertainty reduction theory. It also relates to things like disclosure, right? So for a lot of folks that have maybe like identities that are not clearly visible, for instance, people with invisible disabilities, or folks who might be white passing but not white, right? Those are folks who the decision to disclose and share is something that they have to navigate, thinking about the consequences of sharing that information. So there's 7 major ways to think about or to divide up uncertainty reduction theory, right? And a lot of these are pretty straightforward. A couple are a little bit weird, so you want to walk through them just a bit. And one of them, of course, being that at first, right, you have a lot of uncertainty. If you think back to like the first day that you joined something like a team or an extracurricular, or even like a group in a class, right? You didn't know who other people were. You were getting to know names. You're probably feeling really new or really anxious, right? You didn't know other people, and as a result of not knowing, like that person is safe or good, or if you get along, or a roommate, right? You feel a lot of uncertainty surrounding that person. Pretty straightforward. From there, one key idea is that the more we communicate non-verbally, the less uncertainty we have. And you can think about this because nonverbal communication, again, is a huge part of how we communicate. In fact, it can be up to 85%, right, of our communication. Nonverbal communication is our gestures, our tone of voice, our pitch, our emphasis of certain words, right, our use of touch. All these different things are ways that we can assess the terrain with other people. If somebody is gesturing and they seem defensive, like they're crossing their arms, or they seem like overly aggressive, like they're physically blocking you as you try to talk to them, like that is a major red flag in a way that you'll feel uncertainty in that relationship, right? But at the same time, if somebody conveys warmth, if they're open, if they respect your personal space, if they seem thoughtful, right, then that really means that you feel a lot more comfortable around that person. We use nonverbal communication as a really major cue, especially when we're thinking about things like physical safety, right? Another key idea is that if we don't really know information, right, we're going to gather more. We're going to seek out if we experience uncertainty. So again, if you don't know somebody in the class very well, maybe you ask them questions. Or if you're doing something like a job interview, right, and you're interviewing somebody, you're going to ask them questions to figure out who they are. Because as humans, we like our behavior of other people to be predictable. We like to know that other people are going to be safe and that we can count on them, right? We want to feel like we have the information we need to predict and to prepare. If you have a roommate that you know, like, is always going to go out of town on the weekends, right? You can start to predict that and plan out maybe things like your study schedule, knowing your roommate's availability. Intimacy is lower when uncertainty is higher. Again, pretty straightforward. We become intimate in like social and romantic relationships with people we know and are able to connect with on a deeper level. So this one is probably the trickiest one. That is, with higher uncertainty, there is more communication reciprocity. And here's what that means. If you can think about communication as like an arrow between two people, think about like early times that you're talking and getting to know someone, like a friend or like a roommate, right? When you are first meeting and getting to know somebody, there's a chance that your communication is pretty awkward. In fact, when you're first talking to somebody, it can oftentimes sound like this. How are you doing? Good. How are you? Oh, what year are you? Oh, I'm this year. Where did you go to school? Oh, where did you go to school? Right? It's very back and forth. In other words, it has high reciprocity. The amount you're talking is pretty similar to the amount they're talking. The amount you're listening is pretty similar to the amount they're listening. We do that when we have higher uncertainty because we feel anxious if the scales are tipped, if we're talking or sharing more than the other person. But if we have close friends or family members, people that we have less uncertainty around, We're more comfortable with relationships that are lopsided, with communication that does not always have this back and forth, even amount of talking and listening. With a good friend, right, you're more likely to run into somebody who's venting about a breakup. And maybe you just have a day where you're a listener, where you're there for them and you're listening to them. And that's more okay with lower uncertainty because you've established that groundwork in your friendship. Differences tend to increase uncertainty. Again, this gets at the issue of ethnocentrism, the idea that we tend to think that our own culture is better than others' cultures. We have to switch back against that. If we see differences with other people, again, in terms of things like culture, we tend to understand them less, and maybe that puts our guard up. And then lastly, when we experience higher uncertainty, we tend to like people less, right? Again, we're on guard, we're on edge, we're trying to figure out and understand other people. And as a result of that, we're less willing to connect. So those are the core ideas and things to know about URT, right? This approach that understands relationships in terms of reducing the anxiety that we feel at a fundamental survival level. In addition to that, I want to mention a couple ways that we can think about and differentiate culture, right? Including culture that might happen in small groups. One of them is the idea of time, right? So in a lot of time orientations that are monochromatic, right? For instance, in the United States and Britain, there tend to be a lot more monochromatic time orientation from small groups. Those have strict schedules. You will come into the office at 9 o'clock sharp, right? The use of rigid schedules and planning is monochromatic. Polychromatic time orientation is looser, right? It's less rigid. Let's meet up at around 5 or so, and maybe somebody shows up fashionably late at 5:15. That would be an example of how polychromatic time is a lot more flexible. Some of the ways that this is different, right, could be on the basis, again, of things such as race, disability. For instance, there's an idea known as crip time, right, or the way that folks with disabilities oftentimes require different amounts of time to accomplish tasks. Think about if a sidewalk is not accessible, if there's no stairs nearby and they have to take an elevator on the other end of the hallway, right? It gets at the idea that 24 hours for one person, given things like accessibility, are not the same as 24 hours for somebody else, right? Another idea is short versus long-term time orientation, right? So short-term time orientation tends to focus on immediate benefits and wins, whereas long-term is more about perseverance and trying to reach those long-term goals, right? So depending on the group that you're part of, its time orientation could look different. Are you trying to just survive and grow day to day? Or is this group focused on those long-term goals? And again, things like fulfilling some core needs are probably a big difference between these two. If somebody is a member of a group and their group is secure, right? They have funding, they have support, they have a good set of members, they're probably going to be more focused on long-term goals. Another idea, right, is gender, right? So obviously gender plays a pretty big role in how we think about and define culture. I wanted to show you an interesting example that helps us to think about some of the ways that culture and gender interact in a lot of different ways. And that is, there's a world map of the way that gender diversity is expressed and experienced across a variety of different cultures. I thought was kind of a useful way, and you can, if you want to, play around with this after class. In countries such as New Zealand, right, there are Indigenous and First Nation peoples, including Maori culture, in which there's the term to describe men who accompany women and take on more feminine occupations, right? In places such as Australia, there are trans individuals, right, who kind of have this role of acceptance and support, right? And there's some unique terminology to describe that. And also the way that in certain peoples, including Mino, right, there was the dynasty of all female warriors that were unmarried and did not have children that tended to display maybe more aggressive traits, right? All kind of interesting examples, and again, there's a ton more to get through, including a lot of the Indigenous and First Nation populations of some of these groups. But these examples show us, right, depending on the culture or the group or the population we're talking about, the way that gender is defined and expressed is going to look really different. What's considered masculine, feminine, anywhere within, between, or outside of those categories, right, is going to look really different. So thinking about the way gender is expressed and engage with society, I think it's a useful way of thinking about this too. Directness is important, right? You can think about direct communication as a straight line, indirect communication as a squiggly line, right? Saying, hey, I want to go to the store versus, hey, are you running low on pasta? Maybe we could consider going to the store, right? Which is a lot less direct. There's another difference between cultures. More collectivist cultures tend to be less direct in their communication because direct communication might be considered to be rude or impolite given the scenario. Materialism, right? So materialism is another pretty big role, right, on physical goods and items. So I always have found the phrase money talks to be interesting. It implies like a level of agency, right, to dollar bills. So some cultures tend to put a lot more emphasis on materialism, on goods, again, things like money. Hey, look, I got a new lamp, right, on physical objects and things, while other cultures might be more focused on people or on relationships. For instance, right, a lot of religious or spiritual groups tend to ask people to donate money or to provide more communal support out of the belief that the connections of members of that group or church are more important than the material aspects of life, right? So materialism could be things such as money, right? Or as we've seen with all this NFT business, materialism could also be those like really weird images of monkeys that are NFTs now. Power distance is another idea, right? So one easy way to check power distance is if you're thinking about a group like an extracurricular that you're a part of. How open are you with somebody like your team captain or your coach or your teacher, right? That's power distance. If you feel like you can openly talk to, express your opinion, disagree without consequence, right? Then that's low power distance. And groups and cultures with low power distance, there's this open communication, right? And a superior or supervisor or somebody else, right, is somebody that you can directly address concerns with. That tends to be more common in individualistic cultures, right, where there's lower power distance and people talk a little bit more openly. Higher power distance, right, means that in those types of cultures, a leader is not somebody that you cross or that you talk back to. Higher power distance means you're more likely to defer and listen to a leader rather than to directly have disagreement or express those disagreements. And that's something we see more in collectivist cultures. So what I want to do now is using some of the things that we've been talking about so far on different ways to define and to think about cultures, as well as what we've been talking about so far in uncertainty reduction theory. I'm going to be dividing into groups again, and then what I'm going to be having us do is, first of all, using this scenario. So Luis wants to join a hiking club on campus that has 6 members. However, he's worried about fitting into the new group. So for part 1, I want you to think about uncertainty reduction. How does uncertainty and reduction theory impact his communication to the group? The way that Luis chooses to interact with and get to know members of the group, knowing that these are people that he has not met with. Secondarily, I want you to flip it. How would URT explain the way the members of the group would interact with Luis? So how would they communicate with him, knowing that he's new? And then lastly, I want you to pick one of those 5 measurements of difference that we talked about: time, gender, directness, materialism, and power distance, and explain the ways that it impacts the group and the ways that the group communicates. Like before, I'll ask that there is 1 person per group that will be in charge of taking notes and turning that in at the end of class with names. So let's go ahead and keep doing what we're doing. So let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then we'll have Zoom folks join together as a group. Take about 10 minutes or so to work on this, and then I'll have groups share some of this together.
Obviously, the person's experience will determine whether he's more open or more discussing about so and how they
Yeah, so we talk about the awards, how I might be a little more timid because it's already. So mentioned encourage new members to not as outgoing as usual.
Be open to taking it one
more
more time.
scared.
Maybe they've done it a million times because he's never done it.
Yeah.
Be open to repeats.
You might not know the group norms yet.
like showing how things are done, how to pack up, how to supply.
Anything else? Timid.
Yeah.
And, worries about video. So, I'll listen to
Encouraging people.
Indeed.
And they might try to like figure out how much he knows, but
Yeah. Might ask them a lot of questions.
see how much they like, you know, kind of help teach you what stuff. Like you already know a lot of that, doesn't need as much of that.
No.
I think a lot of that back and forth, like, hey, where are you from? Basic stuff, just to like get the flow of the conversation started.
You just make sure that they're like thinking out. Because there's more. So like if you guys have a process, you just like, are in your own, like, just think part of it and prepare yourself next week. So you don't say that's what you're doing.
One thing, that you know, is like the group is saying, laying down the foundation, the rules, how things go. And probably saying, hey, you have any questions about this, come to us, this is where you go to.
Club, so they're gonna
Just try, yeah.
so probably gonna be a bit more like the one prevented events. You have a meeting at this time, this place. So if you wait 2 meetings, then okay, if you're late.
don't feel like gender shouldn't be any issue. I bet it's cool. Yeah.
And say that it can impact if like they're starting their culture homes or like.
Mhm.
Like finding out in that room, does that look like? How those communications.
We were just like. keeping this up.
I'll approve yourself.
You enjoy it.
We'll give you about 5 more minutes.
For like measurements, but I can obviously apply this big one. Money for better materials, like tax, I do with my key. So I would say. 500.
Really? Yeah. No.
Take another minute or two to finish up. So close off the break after. Okay. So why don't we start with hearing from the Zoom group? What did you all talk about in terms of the ways that Luis would experience uncertainty reduction theory as he participates in this group?
Sorry, I was trying to fix the screen. So for the first question, we kind of talked about how like it's going to be kind of back and forth, and they may not say as much, but they want to gather information from each other because, I mean, it is a hiking experience, so kind of risky. And then for question 2, less likely to share their experiences with him, especially if he's not opening up, kind of like an outsider of the group. So the experiences of each other would make them both nervous. And then for number 3, time was one of them, because you don't know really how each other will act on a long versus short hike. And then materialism, because there may be people that want to bring materialistic things on a hike rather than others.
Yeah, thanks, Selena. My last class mentioned, right? One example of materialism could be like Luis coming in with like a Lululemon style yoga pants to a hiking trip, right? And so being able to adjust and think about context, of course, matters a lot. I also like the way your group mentioned the logistical concerns too. Having crucial things that you need, such as understanding what to do for safety, might be core things that are communicated at that early level. So thanks for sharing. Why don't we hear from this group on this side? What did you all come up with?
So for the first one, we said that Louise might be a little more timid or less outgoing, just as he comes into like a already predefined group that they all know each other already. So, just not as outgoing. And then number two, we said that the members of the group, they might be encouraging to him and try to figure out like what he knows already and, friendly and engaging conversation with him, just getting him to open up. Then for the last one, we said time would impact the group between like starting and departing times. And we also said it'd be like a monochromatic time oriented group.
Yeah, right. Like get out at the crack of dawn and he's late, then they're probably leaving without him, right? So that way the unwritten rules and norms play into it, definitely play a really big role. I also like, if you're thinking about being a first member of a group, feeling maybe timid or anxious, right? Especially when you're joining a group for the first time, it can feel really intimidating, right? Where everybody knows each other really well and is open with each other. But you're new, right? And you don't have the like inside jokes, you don't know everybody's name, you can't connect with quite the same way. So that can be a challenge, right? Of being open and welcoming to new members, knowing they are in on some of the subtext and inside jokes and traditions that members of the group have. How about the group here on this side?
So for the first one, how he would have to he would have to communicate with the group with. He would just need to be open on his like experience with hiking. If he was like super experienced or if he was like super new, then they'd have to obviously walk him through a little bit like farther, or if he was experienced, they would have to walk him through as much.
Sure.
For question number two on how the members would interact with him, they would just need to like almost think out loud is what we said in our group. They would have to, like, if they did a certain things, like if they prepared something for the hike, like just kind of like let them know why, or don't like exclude them out from like what you're doing or anything like that.
Yeah.
For number three, we also chose time because, like they said, it was like where they're meeting or what time they're meeting, when they're gonna go, and how long the hike's gonna take and whatnot. And then we also did like directness, because if he hasn't been on a certain hike, or if he again is new to hiking, he wouldn't just go in there and be like, oh, this is what I'm gonna do, or, so
Sure.
they'd have to be kind of direct with him, and he'd have to be a little bit more specific.
Yeah, thank you. These are really good observations from the group as well. I really like the point you bring up about how maybe in a way to acclimate and support newer members, right? Current members can say explicitly what it is that their group does and why, in a way that oftentimes goes unsaid or implied otherwise, right? Helping to do a kind of verbal guide. Well, we always start by making sure to fill up our water and checking our packs and doing XYZ, getting our compass and everything downloaded. Like that preparatory work is a really good way, if it's communicated, to support and to welcome new participants. So thank you all for sharing. Again, this helps us to think about how cultures develop over time through things like group membership, participation, and things like uncertainty. So to wrap up for today, we talked about culture and the ways that it impacts behavior and performance. We brought up the idea, again, of uncertainty reduction theory and the way that it impacts culture and participation, including our apprehension and anxiety about joining and participating in new groups. And then some of the ways that cultural difference shapes our communication too. So for next class, we'll be talking about international communication and some of the other ways that culture can impact us as we wrap up some of our discussion for this week. So go ahead and pass forward or email me your group's work. Have a great rest of your day. best of luck with wrapping up your paper today, and we'll see you again on Friday.